Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to be talking about a subject in the realms of spirituality, although it has deviated to something that is seemingly moral, but doesn't quite reach the heights of what you could define as true spirituality. This subject is ethics, and ethics in this contemporary world, particularly corporate ethics, and ethics to do with technology. I'll touch on technology as well, but it's mainly looking at this thing called ethics and the different interpretations of ethics. So basically that's what I'll be looking at, this subject matter called ethics. So let's define this thing called ethics initially. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, ethics is a system of accepted beliefs that control behavior, especially such a system based on morals. So ethics is about morals and how people are supposed to behave. That's the Cambridge interpretation. In the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, ethics is a set of moral principles, a theory or system of moral values. And another interpretation, ethics, as in terms of professional ethics, the principles of conduct governing an individual or a group. So you already see that one is talking about morality, and this one is just a set of principles, which doesn't necessarily mean morality. And then a third, a consciousness of moral importance, a guiding philosophy. So all those interpretations, well, three of them at least, touch on some level of morality or spirituality. The other one is just some kind of guiding principles of conduct, which can be interpreted in many ways, really. So those are the interpretations or definitions of ethics. So ethics, I'll be explaining it in the different perspectives, such as Christianity and these indigenous beliefs and so forth, but it basically stems from these ancient spiritual traditions who had ways of understanding how man relates to the earth and how man is integral to the earth, and these spiritual principles which guide man's behavior and how he interacts with the planet, the animals, the natural environment and so forth, and how man is supposed to treat one another. That is the more in-depth understanding of ethics. But how it relates to the current behavior, particularly in the Western world, although issues of ethics also affect the so-called developing world as well. So what I look at first is some Western perceptions of this thing called ethics. So let me take a look at some Western interpretations. The first one deals with, in the Western world, since around the 16th to 18th century, they went through a phase of what they call enlightenment. This is the phase where they came upon certain types of literature, which took them away from this idea of religion and spirituality. They began to look at the world in a more materialistic sense and turn away from this spiritual understanding of the environment that they're in. In terms of, there are metaphysical forces that operate in the universe and on the earth. But this new Enlightenment period had Western intellectuals focusing mainly on the materialistic, or what they could test in a laboratory. So they developed a concept of looking at the world in terms of how you can experiment and test certain ideas and theories, and test the physical world itself in terms of physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. So this Enlightenment period, it began really when they began to study Greek literature, the literature of the Greek philosophers, And this literature was first translated by the Moors when they had invaded Europe into languages which the Europeans could now pick up these texts and read. So around the 16th century they began to study these texts. And many of them were ancient Kemetic texts, which they're now taking the credit for the discovery of things like gravity, this Isaac Newton. But in fact he had been studying ancient Kemetic texts on the same subject. And it's more or less that he interpreted what he had studied and began to understand what gravity was. But what you learn is that he discovered gravity, which is not necessarily the case. So here it's saying the Enlightenment rift, a process by which the global north, or the west generally, separated at the worlds of rationality from spirituality, and the impact of this rift on ideas related to natural resources management. So they began to look at the world in a rational sense. Rationality in itself is a way of making sense of things based on the information you have or the information you think you have. So you could even have what you might call a spiritual rationality. A spiritual person can also be rational. They look at the world in terms of their understanding and their information that they believe about the world. But the scientific idea of rationality is based on the information that they've scientifically proven, or they think they've scientifically proven, to come to conclusions. So that's one. The next one, the idea of separating out rationality from spirituality is a fundamental Northwest construct. As Smith, I think is a scholar in the early 90s, he puts it, the modern West is the first society to view the physical world as a closed system, whereas much of the thinking in the global South and East often retains its integration of rationality and spirituality. So this concept, this idea of separating rationality from spirituality, probably stems from the writings of Plato. In one of his books, he talks about both the subject of rationality and spirituality. And rationality is one of the chapters in his book. But it seems the Enlightenment scholars chose not to look at his chapters on spirituality and focus mainly on this concept of rationality. Thus, they began to turn away from this thing called the spiritual side of things, basically. But then again, spirituality in Europe at that time was not so sophisticated. Christians had strange beliefs, which, what you might say, because Christianity itself is a spiritual tradition which has steered away from the proper understandings of what the spiritual is. So a lot of their understandings were almost irrational. Not irrational, they didn't make sense, even in a spiritual sense. For example, this idea that God created the earth in 6 days. Although in the Bible it says a day can be 1,000 years, not a literal 1,000 years, but Christians interpreted that it meant a literal 1,000 years. So for them, the earth was created in 6,000 years. But a sensible person will look at it and say that this is not necessarily 6,000 years, because a day could be more than 1,000 years. In the Bible, it was just given an example of 1,000 years. So those are the types of irrational thinking, or not thinking that doesn't make too much sense. It's not meant to be. The Bible itself is not meant to be a literal book, although some were taking it too literally. So this overemphasis on rationality and individualism is another concept or idea that was developed during that period, and they began to move away from this idea of working collectively within a community, and began to focus mainly on the rights of the individual and the freedoms of the individual, as opposed to the global South, who had a more integrated, or what you might call holistic perception of man's relation to nature. So that's a slight view of the Western understanding of, though I look at their Enlightenment period and how that their ways of thinking in the last few hundred years has developed. So this idea of rationalism It's the idea that humans are capable of using their faculty of reason to gain knowledge, but your reason can be based also on spiritual experiences that you have. You can reason based on your experiences, not merely on experimentation. And this concept also of empiricism is the idea that knowledge comes from experience and observation of the physical world. But the experiences can also be spiritual experiences. But the experiences that they talk about in empiricism is the type of experience that the type of physical experiences you have, not these psychological, psycho-spiritual experiences that somebody might have. So, as I was saying before about the ancient texts, what they call the 42 books of Hermes, they're Greek texts that were translated from, well, Hermes, the other name for Hermes is Thoth or Tehuti. So the 42 books of Tehuti, the ancient Kemetic deity of wisdom, is where they gain some of their knowledge in terms of the Enlightenment period and their understanding of the world. Although they missed out or chose deliberately to leave out the spiritual aspect of those things. In relation to this developing Western idea is also the Christian perspective of how man was supposed to behave with nature. And I remember reading the Bible and coming across certain things in the Old Testament in particular, in Genesis, where God gave humankind dominion over the fishes of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon it. That's a text from Genesis, which gives the impression that since man has dominion over those things, that he can do whatever he wants to those things without considering their place in the role of nature. So this often reads as God's granting a license to treat animated nature as a mere means to human ends. Genesis is the origin. It is frequently argued of a consistent Christian disregard for the value and well-being of animals. Also within Christianity is this idea that you can eat certain animals and that you can't eat certain animals. That's across the Abrahamic religions. Although flesh is flesh, it doesn't matter which animal you eat. Anyway, humans basically are supposed to be vegan, but the idea that you can eat whatever animal based on whether it has a cloven foot or not a cloven foot. Although even in ancient Kemet, people, the ordinary people ate animals, but certain animals, because of the behavior of the animals, they said, for example, that eating pigs was not a wise thing because of the scavenging nature of the animal, of the pigs. So things that represented certain types of behavior were not to be consumed. But those who were going through spiritual training are supposed to stay away from meat products entirely. But I think this not eating of pork stems from ancient Kemet, and it was passed on to the Jews and the Arabs when their religions developed. So that's the Christian and some understanding about the Western world perceived ethics and proper behavior towards nature, or how they developed their so-called, their neglect basically of the natural world, only up until recently when they began to see the damage that was being caused by the industrialization and such things, that you find that they're now paying attention to the danger that humans can cause to nature. So I'm going to look at some of the indigenous ideas around ethics and how indigenous people related to nature. So this is from a paper called Indigenous People and Nature and the Natural World. When land is owned, managed, or occupied in a traditional way, the word traditional refers to a knowledge that stems from centuries-old observation and interaction with nature. This knowledge is often embedded in a cosmology that reveres the oneness of life, considers nature as sacred, and acknowledges humanity as a part of it, and then it encompasses practical ways to ensure the balance of the environment in which they live. So it may continue to provide services such as water, fertile soil, food, shelter, and medicine. So this oneness is like, for example, your body is one. All your body parts need to work together to ensure that your body as a whole is healthy. So it's the same example in terms of how man is supposed to treat nature. This is how the indigenous societies saw it, that man is supposed to treat nature in such a way that nature can thrive, as well as humans also being able to thrive. Which means when you, for example, you cut down a tree for whatever purpose, you plant a seed to replace that tree. So you don't exploit nature to the extent that you destroy a whole set of plants or a whole forest without replacing the trees that were in that forest. Or if you use traditional herbs, you always make sure you have a supply of those herbs by planting seeds so the herbs grow again. So that's one example. Another example from the same paper. Due to their subsistence economies and spiritual connection to the lands and territories, most indigenous peoples suffer disproportionately from loss of biological diversity and environmental degradation. This is what has taken place more recently. Their lives, survival, development, chances, knowledge, environment, and health conditions are threatened by environmental degradation, large-scale industrial activities, toxic waste, conflict, and forced migrations, as well as by land use and land cover changes, such as deforestation, which I'll mention later on, agriculture, and the extractive industries. These challenges are further exacerbated by climate change. Climate change itself is caused by, some argue caused by there are some who argue that climate change is not taking place. What's actually happened is that there's a cycle of when carbon emissions, or the levels of carbon in the environment increase every several hundred or every particular period in history. And this last 100 years or so is merely one of those cycles, and that climate change advocates are not looking at the full scope of how the Earth actually behaves to properly understand why the carbon levels are increasing. But then there are those who claim to have a lot of evidence to show that man has affected the levels of carbon in the atmosphere to a greater degree. So those are two ideas around indigenous peoples' understanding. There are different, the colonialists, when they arrive in the different regions of the world, have their understanding of what they see when they come across indigenous societies, because they see them as more backward, and their societies somehow were seen as somehow stagnant and not growing or changing. They didn't realize that one of the reasons you could argue that they're being stagnant is because they remain at a particular level where they're looking at the environment in a sense that they don't want to exploit it too much. They want to maintain a certain level of their civilization or society in which they could live in harmony with nature, as opposed to becoming more advanced to the extent that you start exploiting nature and creating a level of imbalance in the planet's ecosystem. Even the Spanish, when they arrived in the southern parts of the Americas, they were marveled, or they were surprised at the scientific and bureaucratic accomplishments of the people there at the time, but later on they behaved as if these people were savages. That's what they would write later on, that these people are somehow backward, merely because they wanted to exploit them, enslave them, or wipe out their civilizations and take over the land. But in reality, they were surprised at how accomplished these people were. So even concepts like the idea of human rights could have come out of that period where colonized people were resisting the colonization process of the Europeans, or their endeavors to colonize those people. So their protests against exploitation is, some argue, what spurred the concepts of human rights within even European societies. And even nowadays, with the amount of damage being caused ecologically, some are looking back to those traditional practices of indigenous groups and how they maintain their societies or their natural environment. And this is happening mainly because a lot of the natural environment is disappearing, and now they want to keep it. They have to turn to indigenous peoples to find out how they actually maintained their societies or their environment. So let's take a look at looking mainly at the different ways of thinking in terms of the Western Christian, Judeo-Christian type of mindset. And then I've looked at the indigenous. So now let's look at how the corporate sector actually thinks about the issue of ethics and how nature is supposed to be treated. So what is meant by corporate ethics? I explained ethics earlier on, but this is an interpretation of corporate ethics. Corporate ethics refers to the moral behavior of a company and its employees while conducting business. Business ethics is another name for corporate ethics. Business ethics reflects the purpose of doing the business. Business ethics is the distinction between what is right and wrong in the workplace and the selection of rights set of actions. Every corporate entity follows business ethics to a large extent in order to survive and compete successfully in the market. Yes and no. Companies will try and get away with what they want to, what they can, in terms of if they're extracting a particular resource, and if they can get away with leaking the waste in the process of extracting or refining that resource, they will, and they did for many years, until the society around them began to complain or make a lot of noise, basically, about the damage being done to the rivers and so forth. These are what caused the development of so-called Western ethics. It's not that they had the ethics in the first place, that the ethics developed out of protest from governments and the communities that were being affected by the damage caused to their environment, such as the rivers and the air, even the air, because during the 70s, for example, a lot of these factories, I'm not sure what they were producing, but part of the waste coming out of these large chimneys in factories that you used to see in the 70s was sulfur dioxide. And when sulfur dioxide goes up into the atmosphere, it mixes with water to create sulfuric acid. So it created what you call acid rain in that period. And you see forests across Europe which had lost their trees, or the trees had been damaged or destroyed by the acid, by the effects of this so-called acid rain. So, in fact, you don't really hear about acid rain nowadays because those type of factories have declined greatly because of the damage that they were causing. Anyway, let me have a this is an example of a company that was taking advantage of the Supreme Court in the US in 1919 in a case called the Dodge v. Ford Motor Company. The Michigan Supreme Court famously ruled that Ford had to operate in the interest of its shareholders as opposed to its employees and managers, which meant prioritizing profit and return on investment. So here it's an ethical issue, not in terms of the damage to the environment, but in terms of how the company treated its workers. So it's a case where the shareholders were more important than its workers, shareholders and profit. So in many of the companies, I say prior to the 60s or 70s, workers were not treated very well. Their working hours were exceptionally long, and their working conditions were poor, because the company, owners of the company basically were looking at making a profit. So the treatment of the workers was not well, as long as they could get as many hours out of their workers as possible. That was all they were concerned about. So even in this court case, the courts themselves chose in favor of the company. Maybe there were bribes paid, you never know. But in those days, as far back as 1919, ethics in terms of how companies treated their workers was quite bad. Anyway, in terms of more recent years, the United Nations Global Compact is one of these standards that were created to look at these issues of corporate ethics. Its mission is to mobilize companies and stakeholders to create a world in which business align their strategies and operations with a set of more core principles covering human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption practices. The Global Compact is a voluntary initiative based on the CEO, this Chief Executive Officer, commitments to implement universal sustainability principles and to undertake partnerships in support of the UN Development Goals. I think this is in terms of the environment. So basically, this is a compact, although it's voluntary, which means companies are not strictly bound to abide by it, but it's almost a guide into how they're supposed to treat their workers and the environment. These are more recent things. In the trade agreements or the World Trade Organization agreements or policies, as say in the 90s, many of these things were not there. So foreign companies could exploit and treat workers in another country as they will. For example, even more recently, you see that these large companies, they set up factories in poor developing countries and the working conditions are not good, or they hire companies in these regions to produce things like garments and so forth, and their working conditions are not good. But nowadays there are supposed to be global regulations and rules about how you behave in terms of the type of workplace that you create or the type of companies you hire internationally in terms of how they treat their workers. So business ethics have changed over the years. As I was saying, they are very poor up until more recently, when, apart from the damages that has been caused to the environment, workers' unions and so forth have pushed companies to treat their workers better. Let's look at some of the damages now in terms of the environment. I'll be touching on the environment, also some of the newer technologies and the worries about things like GMOs and nano-technologies in medicine. So in terms of deforestation, I'm going to look at some factual information in terms of how it has affected forests, for example. Here, the Union of Concerned Scientists reports that just 4 commodities are mostly responsible for the vast majority of tropical deforestation: beef, soy, palm oil, and wood products as timber. So wood products mainly because he chopped down the forest to create wood products. Palm oil is another because he chopped down a large amount of forest area to plant palm oil trees, and palm oil trees, they say, damages the soil to a certain extent. So even after you plant those trees there, even after you clear that area, there'll be a certain amount of damage to the soil that you can't replant trees so easily. Soy. So these are the main, either human consumption. I know soy is consumed as cattle feed. Palm oil is used to It's used in soap, it's used in creating lubricant oil. So it's a very widely used oil. It has been so since the Industrial Revolution, when they needed palm oil for oiling and greasing the machineries of that period. Beef, that is human consumption. So humankind in general is eating a lot more meat than they would have when the societies were more agricultural and more rural living. In the West, people eat meat almost 3 times a day, but if you go to certain developing countries, not because of they don't have the money, because the lifestyle was different. Even though you had cows and other animals, you didn't eat meat every day. It could have been eaten once a week, or to some extent once a month. It's only this Western lifestyle that has created the environment where people consume meat 3 times a day and every day. So UCS estimates that an area the size of Switzerland is lost to deforestation every year. And all this timber that is disappearing. Forests also are a source of food, medicine, and fuel for more than 1 billion people, and they provide 13.4 million people with jobs in the forest sector. Another 41 million people have lost jobs related to forests because they have disappeared. In North America, about half the forests in the eastern part of the continent were cut down for timber and farming between the 1600s and the 1800s. So a vast amount of timber is being used and not being replaced, because it's easy to cut down a forest, and even replacing is not that. If the plant seeds are there, you can plant them. Many of the trees that they're cutting down, the seeds are available for them to plant, but they don't bother. They're just looking after the money that they're making, rather than looking at the future of the timber industry or the environment in general. So about 3.9 million square miles of forest have been lost since the beginning of the 20th century. In the past 25 years, forests have shrunk by over 500,000 square miles. It's a size bigger than South Africa. So forests, if they don't, I think that some projects have taken place that are replanting trees, but whether they're planting at the rate that would allow them to replace those trees that have gone, that one I don't think. Now if we look at water, 3/4 of the Earth's fresh water comes from forested watersheds, and the loss of trees can worsen water quality. So it even affects the water system if forests are cut down. Then agriculture, they say, is also a player in the destruction of the, as in terms of danger to the environment. So agriculture was responsible for 59% of total freshwater use in Europe in 2017, and 22% of Europe's surface water bodies and 28% of the groundwater area are significantly affected by diffuse pollution from agriculture. So even agriculture, but then again, this is probably this Western type monocropping agriculture, where you mass produce crops over several hundred acres or square miles of land. But they say even the food production in the world is more than enough to feed humanity. And probably, I don't know if it's arguing that twice the amount, or there's a significant amount of food produced that could easily feed humanity. So this claim that there's not enough food to feed humanity and they need to start experimenting with food so that it produces better yields is really a false narrative. But in terms of the current technologies that are affecting, that's the idea of ethics, where does ethics come into it, I should say, is GMOs. How do you look at GMOs in terms of how GMOs are created? This idea that you can tamper with the genetics of an animal or a crop and inject aspects of a gene from another plant or another animal to give it a resistance or to increase its yield is a very controversial issue. It's also an ethical issue, the ethics of tampering with nature. So let me have a look at two quotations here. This is from the non-GMO project. A GMO, or genetically modified organism, is a plant, animal, or microorganism that has been subjected to biotechnology. GMOs can be processed into ingredients which are also genetically modified. Genetically modified ingredients are present in food and personal care products. GMO developers used biotechnology to alter an organism's fundamental characteristics, and biotechnology includes the techniques such as synthetic genetic sequences to change the organism's genetic material. So it's about changing the structure of the genetics of a commodity. And here are some examples. There are 5 examples here. Corn or maize. It's changed, maize containing bacterial genes that cause the plant to produce an insect. So corn as a plant doesn't natively produce insecticide, but they have tampered with it so that it produces an insecticide to kill certain insects which may be natural to for them to move towards or be attracted to a corn, but these insecticide genetics that they've created for the corn will kill these insects. Then you have fast-growing, this is not a plant, this is a fast-growing Atlantic salmon. Salmon is a fish with genes from a Chinook salmon and an ocean. So this is a salmon fish with genes from a different type of salmon and another type of fish, an ocean pout. So they've tampered with probably the eggs of the salmon fish and injected certain genes from other types of fish to give it some type of, it makes it more fast growing. So if you want your salmon, if you're a fish farmer and you're growing salmon and you want to have a better yield, that they've tampered with these fish so that they grow more quickly. Then you have soybeans with edited genes which increase the amount of oleic acid. I'm not sure what the meaning of that is. Oleic acid is, it seems, something that would protect the plant from some kind of pest. Hens, chickens, with an inserted lethality gene that can kill their male offspring before they hatch. So you want hens that only produce females. That's what this is arguing now, or saying. So these are 5 examples of what genetics are, GMOs are used for. They're used to create a situation where a plant or animal behaves in a way which it wouldn't normally behave. But the problem with GMOs, you don't know, after tampering with the genetics of that plant or animal, you don't know the long-term damage that can be caused by the use of these chemicals, or this tampering with the genetics of that particular animal or creature. So the main reason they want to control the pests, as I said with the maize. So many GMO crops have been modified so that they repel the insects that would normally affect them. So in a sense, you won't have to use pesticides because the plant will repel the pest by itself. Then you have, these are 5 of the so-called benefits. You get pest control, fewer pesticides, as I said, because if the plants are repelling the pests themselves, you don't need the pesticides. And so it has reduced the global chemical pesticide use by 8.3%. This is according to a 2020 study. And indirectly reduce greenhouse gas emissions because farmers don't need to spray their fields so often. Really? Instead of spraying the fields, you have plants or abnormal plants growing in that field. So it gives the impression that it's something good, but really the plants themselves have become abnormal. So they're not attracting the insects that they would normally attract. Improve survival and greater yield. Really, other GMO crops have been modified with genes that help them survive stressful conditions. This idea that GMO crops provide greater yield has been proven false over the long term. Yes, the first 1 or 2 years, the yield might be better, but what I've found is that the yield decreases over time to the state where it was less than the original crop, the unmodified crop. So over the long term, the use of GMOs, in that aspect anyway, has not been proved to be beneficial. Increased nutritional value. Genetic modification can increase the nutritional value of foods. For example, rice high in beta-carotene, this yellow rice that they're talking about, or now golden rice, to help prevent blindness in regions. Instead of giving people modified rice, you provide a more diverse diet where people can, even farmers can grow food that is concentrated in beta-carotene, instead of providing them with something that has been tampered with. You go into the society and encourage the farmers to diversify their agricultural produce so that there's a greater supply of the required nutritional foods that they need. Enhanced flavor. You really want to genetically modify something so that it tastes better? No, not really. And the last one is nanotechnology or nanomedicine. Nanomedicine. The field of nanomedicine encompasses the utilization of nanoparticles for diagnosis and therapeutic purposes. In general, nanoparticles are used as delivery vehicles for imaging and therapeutic agents, e.g. small molecules, proteins, peptides, and nucleic acids. To date, a plethora of nano-based drugs have been designed to treat various diseases such as neurological disorders, diabetes, cancer, infectious diseases, and allergies. But these nanotechnologies have their dangers. There are certain categories of nanoparticles that have been frequently reported to have cytotoxic effects. For example, carbon-based nanoparticles have been displayed in toxicity in vitro and in vivo assays. In particular, carbon nanotubes have been shown to induce mesothelioma, thereby mimicking the toxicity of asbestos, a naturally occurring carcinogenic material. So these carbon-based nanoparticles, they can cause cancerous effects in the body. Because nanotechnology is a wide subject, I've touched on it briefly here, but they're talking about these minute molecule-sized nanoparticles that they can insert into your bloodstream and acts almost like the white blood cells, which attach to various diseases and viruses or bacteria in the blood. So they want to create an artificial type molecule that it runs through the bloodstream and attacks certain particles, or it can provide certain types of processes in the different parts of the body. Though it can also be used negatively if they want to program a nanoparticle to cause damage to somebody. There's also a risk there. So I've looked at various subjects here in terms of the environment, ethics towards the new technologies such as GMOs, although GMOs have been around for at least 30 years now. Nanotechnology, although it's more recently talked about, it's also been around for at least 20 years, but it has become more advanced nowadays. But in terms of ethics and the way the Western world is looking at the way it has been using the technologies it is creating, or even the fact that it has created such technologies at all, you have to ask the question, should man be going in that direction of tampering with the genetics of nature, and then creating minute particles, nanoparticles that can be injected in the body or the bloodstream to carry out what the body already has natural ways of doing, but man seems to be able to, or want to create his own version of how to heal the body rather than depend on the natural born way of healing the body, or how the, well, manipulating how the body, because there's ways you can enhance your own bacterial resistance, or enhance how your body becomes effective, or your own immune system. There's ways of naturally building your immune system to fight diseases, on keeping the body healthy, rather than creating artificial substances that can do that work for you. In a sense, man is trying to play the role of the creator in how the creator creates and maintains the world. So man wants to take over that role, yet man doesn't have the proper understanding of the world. Well, Western man anyway. That is it for now.